Thank you for tuning in today and welcome back to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Zain Raza. Before I start this interview, I would like to share with you that we are in the last days of our crowdfunding campaign. This campaign is aiming to raise enough funds so that we can continue with our independent and non-profit journalism in 2024. Journalism that is viewer-funded and does not take any money from corporations or governments. If we raise enough funds, we will be able to cover our costs that includes, for example, tax advising, insurance, post-production, voiceover, translation, correction, and many others. If you're unable to raise enough funds, we will unfortunately have to scale back on our capacities. So if you're watching our videos regularly, make sure to donate just a small amount, $2 to $3 or euros, by checking out the links to the donation platforms in the description of this video below. If all of 145,000 subscribers just donate that amount, we will be able to not only achieve our crowdfunding target, but also be able to cover our costs for the next 2 to 3 years. Today, I'll be talking to activist and physician Dr. Jill Stein on Israel's war in Gaza. Dr. Jill Stein is also running for president again in the United States for the Green Party USA, which we will also discuss in length in this interview. Dr. Jill Stein, welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, Zain, as always.
Let us start with a fundamental assessment before moving into recent issues. After the October 7 terrorist attacks of Hamas that killed at least 1,200 Israelis, 1,318 of whom were military personnel, Israel responded by declaring war in Gaza. So far, Israel has killed 22,000 Palestinians, 70% of them being women and children. According to the UN, around half of the people of Gaza are facing starvation, 8 in 10 Gazans are now homeless, and in total 2 million people have been displaced, all because of Israel's relentless assault. Could you provide your response, in particular to Hamas's October 7 attacks, and thereafter also comment on Israel's response?
Yeah, so I abhor all forms of violence against people, and to me that applies across the board. I condemn all attacks on civilians. Period. However, what's going on the part of the Netanyahu government is in a league of its own, and it's been recently documented by a study with the Washington Post that the assault from Israel going on in Gaza exceeds in intensity, speed, and extent everything else, everything else that there is a record of. The destruction is just off the charts, not only of buildings as you characterized, but, on the press, on civilians. There's collective punishment going on. There's no question about that. Essentially, the entire population is in a state of starvation now, and the hunger crisis going on is greater also than all other hunger crises on record, including the history with Afghanistan and in Yemen, given the speed and intensity of it. You also have this concentrated mass of humanity in squalid conditions. People have been driven out of their homes, many of them dying in their homes, and the figure of 22,000 killed is an underestimate considering how many are under the rubble, dying and dead. This is ongoing, and people were driven south along routes they were told would be safe, but which were not safe. People are being shuttled along in makeshift wheelchairs. The handicapped and the disabled. There's no way to get there under car or bus or anything else. People are on foot, being driven like cattle, bombed as they flee, and then they're being bombed when they get to where they're going, as refugee centers and so on are also subject to 2,000-pound bunker busters, which are being dropped on them, all with the essentially the assistance, the aid and abetting by the United States and our tax dollars. We are basically providing the bombs and the munitions and selling the aircraft from which they are being dropped. This is on all of us. This is absolutely intolerable. And the final thing to mention is that we may have seen nothing yet, because with people concentrated under squalid conditions, sick, they're starving, so they're all, in horrible health condition. This is a setup for an epidemic of infectious diseases that could wipe people out at a rate that, we ain't seen nothing yet compared to the brutality that's going on. So this is if we have a shred of human decency, we have to stop this. I grew up as a Jew just after the Holocaust, and I grew up committed to the proposition that genocide would not happen again. But clearly, we are looking at what many authorities claim now is a textbook case of genocide. And, there's no denying this is absolute ethnic cleansing by design. So, these are war crimes on steroids. If we have a shred of human decency, we have to stop them, because as Gaza goes, basically this sets the standard for the world. We have to stop this.
For the sake of objectivity, I would like to present some arguments that are heard in the German media. For example, Israel has to eliminate Hamas in order to secure its society from terrorist attacks, such as the one that happened on October 7th. And secondly, all of these deaths that have come around, 22,000 of Palestinians, including women and children, are primarily the responsibility of Hamas that have taken these people as human shields. Could you address these arguments?
It's important to have historical context here. This conflict did not begin on October 7th. If you say that Israel is, exercising retribution, well, Hamas is also exercising retribution. And there have been an endless series of attacks, degradation, basically violence as a way of life. And enormous numbers, many tens of thousands who have also been killed prior to this, that, Israel, for better or worse, had ethnic cleansing from the get-go, and Palestinians were basically shuttled out of the way. And this is not to deny that anti-Semitism and the violence committed against the Jewish people, that is a reality, and was really a state of longstanding terror that the Zionists were responding to. However, if the response to terror is more terror, there will be no end to it. And and what's going on now is just head and shoulders above what preceded it. So this doesn't come out of nowhere. In terms of the deaths being the responsibility of Hamas, well, but then the violence committed on Hamas was the responsibility of the IDF for decades in advance. You had ethnic cleansing of at least 750,000 people, and you had many tens of thousands of deaths that were committed over the course of decades. So the solution here is international law. International law doesn't exist, by happenstance. It's intended to solve this kind of problem and to interrupt this endless series of retribution. But as I say, the retribution that's going on now is just orders of magnitude worse than anything that's ever been done before, and it absolutely has to be stopped.
I would like to take this conversation to the international level and then move to the regional and domestic aspects. On the 12th of December 2023, the United Nations General Assembly voted to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. A clear majority that included 153 nations voted in favor of a ceasefire, while 10 voted against it and 23 abstained. The most powerful nation that voted against it, a ceasefire, was obviously the United States of America. On the 23rd of December 2023, the United Nations Security Council finally passed a resolution on more aid for Gaza. However, after days of negotiation, the text of the resolution was essentially watered down and did not call for an immediate ceasefire, and instead calls for steps to be taken to create conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. Can you talk about the role of the United States, in particular why it keeps vetoing any resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire?
Yeah, this is outrageous, and this is the role that the U.S. has performed over, really since the founding of Israel, that the U.S. has really blocked the expression of the world community of, concern and outrage and efforts to correct the violations of international law that have been longstanding. And this does not do Israel any favors. In the long run, this puts Israel in a very precarious position. And, we can talk more about that later. But what's going on now is extremely dangerous for Israel. And we're seeing conflicts now erupt throughout the Middle East, and particularly on Israel's border. And more players are being mobilized where Israel had made some progress with some of its neighbors. That now has basically been torn to shreds, and its neighbors are being mobilized to stop this outrage. And the sympathies of the world right now, given a genocide on full display being live streamed by its victims. This is incredible. And Al Jazeera is also live streaming the nightly attacks going on from Lebanon. They have a beautiful view of the explosions in Gaza. So the world community, and especially the Arab community, is being quite mobilized right now. And this has become an incredible powder keg. And, just remember that one nuclear submarine now carries the equivalent of 4,000 Hiroshima bombs. 4,000. There is a nuclear submarine off the coast of Gaza. I don't know if it's nuclear armed or not. I have not seen that as public information. We don't know. At least I don't know, and I haven't seen anybody who does. But whether there are nuclear weapons there or not, I mean, we know that Israel is nuclear armed, and this thing could proliferate so quickly. Iran has just sent a battleship into the Red Sea as the conflict pertaining to shipping, begins to explode, and which is going to have a huge impact on the economy as well as the flow of fossil fuels down the Red Sea becomes, impossible. So, there are enormous consequences here, including engagement that could go nuclear. And remember, nuclear war doesn't happen over there. It happens to all of us wherever it occurs. And for example, if one nuclear submarine was to discharge its weapons, heaven forbid, 4,000 Hiroshima bombs going off creates enough nuclear winter, that is debris that's cast into the upper atmosphere and which basically blocks sunlight to various degrees over a course of years. It reduces agricultural production sufficient to cause basically global starvation. 1/3 of the world's population would die from one nuclear submarine, and that's just one. So in this day and age where we are armed to the teeth and nuclear arms are growing in part because the treaties have been destroyed, particularly by the actions of the U.S. This is unbelievably dangerous, unspeakably dangerous, and everyone needs to see themselves in the target hairs of this exploding conflict and put it to a stop right now using the power of international law. And the U.S. needs to get out of the way of the expressions of international law by the UN Security Council and the General Assembly.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States was very adamant for invoking international law, calling for sanctions, mobilizing the ICC. However, when Israel is now attacking Gaza and has been historically, as you mentioned, annexing Palestinian territory every year to year, even though the United States has voiced some criticism, it has never followed up with concrete sanctions. Why do you think there's this double standards? On the one hand, when Russia annexes territory, Ukrainian territory, it is followed up with sanctions. But on the other hand, when Israel annexes Palestinian territory, there's only criticism, but no sanctions. Why is there this double standards in the US policy?
Well, I would say that double standards and hypocrisy are the name of the game with U.S. international policy. Remember that our military general philosophy is described as full spectrum dominance. Going all the way back to the breakup of the old Soviet Union, the U.S. was very clear. Our policy is to suppress the emergence of any regional power. Period. Regional or global, but even at the level of region, the U.S. policy explicitly prohibits the emergence of an economic or military power, and we will suppress it. And Anthony Blinken and company, they don't talk about international law. They talk about, I forget what their term for it is, but it's basically we call the rules here. We call the shots and we get to change it from moment to moment, which is what they do, and which is why the U.S. has lost credibility. So this is not only, a disaster for the people of Gaza. This is a disaster for Israel, and this is also a disaster for the U.S. And this is really speeding the transition from this unipolar world where we were basically the bully in the schoolyard to a multipolar world that must get along with each other. And there is a very strong emergence now of the alternative economy through the BRICS, which is growing through its development agencies, and they have access to a lot of oil and fossil fuel energy. So we have basically lost the stranglehold on world power. And as we recede, as the sun sets on the era of the U.S. empire, we better get moving to shore up international law, or we ourselves will be victims of this, of this state of chaos that we have helped to create.
Another significant international development last week was that South Africa became the first country to file a lawsuit against Israel at the International Court of Justice. This adds to the international pressure on Israel to end its assault, in which, as you've already mentioned, 22,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of them being women and children. South Africa is accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza in violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group, unquote. How do you assess this development, and do you think this will put enough pressure on Israel to stop its actions?
This is a very important development, and it's really to the credit of South Africa that they have stood up to do this. And in some of the international commentary before this, some observers, one in particular, was saying a former ambassador, a former U.S. ambassador to Uzbekistan, who's now very politically active, and he was saying that the reason nations were hesitating was not because this wouldn't work, but rather because it's very, it is so true that it's going to be virtually impossible for a conviction not to go through. And that just has staggering consequences, because if a finding of genocide, or ethnic cleansing is made, then the IJC, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court then have a right to basically issue arrest warrants for our leaders, and that includes U.S. leaders as well as Israeli, because our hands are covered in blood here in this. And if our leaders had their own security in mind, they would be calling this whole thing off right now while they still can do that. So this is a very important development. The problem is that these wheels do not turn quickly. From my, limited understanding of this process, this doesn't happen like right away. And right now you have 2 million people. We are on a death watch right now for 2 million people who could be days or even just hours away from an epidemic that completely wipes them out. They don't have food, and they don't have water, and they don't have a place to put their heads, or a place to wash, or a place to toilet. I mean, it's like you couldn't design more torturous conditions for families, innocent families and children, than what's going on right now. And this could lead to the worst possible consequences imaginable very quickly. And that's the problem with this strategy, and why we must also, invoke political solutions. There are political solutions. This could be solved in the blink of an eye, and we can talk more about that.
I want to move to the regional dimensions of this conflict, which you briefly mentioned. Last week, an Israeli airstrike in Damascus, Syria, killed a high-ranking Iranian general named Sayyid Razi Muzafi, a longtime advisor of the Iranian paramilitary Revolutionary Guard in Syria. Today, it is being reported that a drone strike that many suspect was conducted by Israel killed a senior Hamas official named Saleh al-Ori in Beirut, Lebanon. In your view, does Israel have the right to conduct extrajudicial assassinations in foreign countries such as Iran and Syria in the name of self-defense? And how close do you think we are to a regional war?
They do not have the right. I mean, you can't, yeah, I mean, that's just not going to fly. And any country could define any assassination as self-defense. That doesn't make it legal. It's not. And this is very dangerous territory now, and is certainly, one has to wonder, is Netanyahu trying to do this? Is he trying to enlarge the war and drag the U.S. into it? And this is an utter disaster. And Netanyahu is a nutcase, and his government is the extreme far right now. They are the thing that they claim, they're all, they're quick to accuse Hamas of being Nazi-like. But, when you're committing genocide, it's hard to be, more right-wing extremist and fascist than committing genocide. So, this is a very dangerous partner for the U.S. to be working with. And it's just another reason why we need to reboot here. We need to completely reboot our relationship with Israel and with the Middle East in general, and make it consistent with international law. And that should include the global treaty now against nuclear weapons, and to ban them. And that will make all of us safer in one fell swoop. But that's very much the direction that we must go as quickly as possible.
Another major escalation, which you also mentioned, is happening in the Red Sea. The Yemenis armed militia called the Houthis have vowed to stop all commercial ships bound for Israel until Israel stops its genocide. And to counter this, the US built a naval coalition in the Red Sea. On the 1st of January 2024, the US military reported that it killed 10 Houthi fighters and sank 3 of the Yemeni armed groups' vessels in the Red Sea. I also want to cite an excerpt of a speech made by the army spokesman of the Houthis, and let me quote him here, quote, "They bombarded our hospitals, they bombarded our markets, bombarded our roads, bombarding our people while they were sound asleep in their homes, just like it happened to us. It's the same aggression, the same American bombs being poured on Gaza, with the same ones being poured on us in Yemen. The aggressor is the one, the aggression is one. The leader of it is America. The one who has led the aggression in Yemen is the same one who is leading it in Palestine." What do you make of these statements by the Houthis? Should they be taken seriously or simply dismissed?
Well, it's true. You can't argue with the facts. You may not want to hear them, but this is true. And, though our compliant media stays silent about much of this, this is what's going on the ground. And this is really why I think it's important, to think that Gaza isn't just Gaza. Gaza is all of us. And if we degrade the standard of humanity, if we allow this genocide to go forward, we are really incurring the wrath of many nations here that are very sympathetic. The U.S. has sent its military 250 times over the past 30 years. That is according to the Congressional Research Service. So we do this, according to William Blum, the author who cataloged U.S. regime change operations, enumerated 55 of them, and that was just going up to approximately 2018, and there have been many since. So there is enormous. And even going back to Martin Luther King, he described it as, my country is the greatest purveyor of violence that in the world today. And that pertains today. Our military budget is equivalent to the next biggest 9 countries' military budgets world over. So we are viewed really as the purveyor of violence. And there's a lot of karma that goes with that. And we're asking for trouble. And this sense of, entitlement that we can inflict violence on the whole world and think that it's not coming back to bite us, it absolutely is. It is right now. And I'm sure you know that there have been over 100 attacks now on U.S. bases in the vicinity of the Middle East right now. And we are alarming and mobilizing a lot of firepower against us. And that includes Hezbollah, which is a far stronger player, and thousands of Israelis are at risk now. They are going to start dying as well if we allow this war to expand, to bring in Hezbollah, and particularly Iran. And Iran, as of yesterday, what I heard, and I haven't seen the news about this today, but it looked like Iran has now sent a battleship in to defend the Houthis, whose 3 ships were sunk by the U.S. last week. So this is just exploding before our eyes. And let's not be naive about where this goes. We have potentially, a conflagration that is going to be as devastating to Israel as it is to other countries. And this could go ballistic from there as well, and could entail the use of nuclear weapons, which are, extremely dangerous because they have a global impact. Regardless of where they explode, they emit, enough debris to contribute to nuclear winter. And it doesn't take that many so-called low-level nuclear bombs to actually begin to really devastate the global food supply. So we have to consider ourselves in the crosshairs of this conflict.
Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is from the extreme far-right religious Zionism party, received strong condemnation, including from the US, for making the following statement, and let me quote him here. "Our resettlement policy is necessary. A small country like ours cannot afford a reality where 4 minutes away from our communities there is a hotbed of hatred and terrorism, where 2 million people wake up every morning with aspiration for the destruction of the state of Israel and with a desire to slaughter, rape, and murder Jews wherever they are." Unquote. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, another senior far-right Israeli figure, responded to the US condemnation by making the following remarks on the platform X. Quote, "I really admire the United States of America, but with all due respect, we are not another star in the American flag." Why do you think Israel can continue with a carte blanche and even embarrass the United States publicly while incurring not even any form of repercussions or sanctions? Does the United States control policy in Israel, or is it the other way around?
Yeah, well, whoever is calling the shots, it's probably both. It's a disaster for all of us. And this goes way back, this kind of joined at the hip foreign policy. And back in the Reagan era, you had his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, describing Israel as the unsinkable battleship for the U.S. in the Middle East. And the U.S. has traditionally relied on Israel as an outpost of U.S. influence at the center of fossil fuels. And now the U.S. itself is the biggest provider of fossil fuels in the world. So things have changed. You have AIPAC, which has just pledged $100 million actually to defeat those who dare utter the word, ceasefire in the U.S. Congress. So certainly AIPAC and the control of money. But one can ask, the same question for our fossil fuel and energy policies, for our healthcare system, which is the most expensive in the world and the worst among developed nations in terms of its effectiveness. Our school system, which is crumbling, and the mountain of debt that not only young people have to pay for their to get educated, to have a chance in today's economy. They're in debt from the get-go. I mean, we have a crazy system because it's essentially run by money. In the words of the Supreme Court Justice from the past century, Louis Brandeis, we have a choice between a democracy or vast concentrations of wealth. We have vast concentrations of wealth on steroids, which has essentially bought out our political system. And if you're really going to fix this, it requires quite a system reboot so that we put we take the big money out of our political system and put the people back in. It's definitely, short on that. And that expresses itself in things like our unbelievably irrational foreign policy, which is, as we said, this is full spectrum dominance. This is about dominating the world, which not only doesn't work, it's also bankrupting us because this is usurping half of the U.S. Congressional budget. We are spending basically $1 trillion a year for the endless war machine. And as a consequence, we have tens of millions of people who do not have health care or housing, who are swamped in debt, who are on the verge of eviction. President Biden recently started up student debt payments again. Donald Trump had stopped them, had paused them, and Joe Biden had reinstituted them when they didn't have to happen, which has not made young people, shall we say, feel indebted and favorable to Joe Biden. But when these debt payments started up, 40% of students were unable to make those payments. This is the economic condition right now of the American people. 60% are living paycheck to paycheck. So, we are in free fall right now as a society here in the US, and our resources are being expended on genocide. What does that say about our current, bipartisan regime? It has to go. It has to go, just like genocide has to be stopped.
Let us move to the United States. Could you provide us a breakdown of how the political parties are positioning themselves towards Gaza? In particular, I would like to know the state of the Democratic Party, the Progressives, the Centrists, and Republican parties. Are there any voices at the moment that are calling openly that there's a genocide taking place in Gaza?
I haven't heard anybody using that word. For the most part, they have all been in lockstep and, in perfect harmony and agreement that Israel has to, quote, defend itself by slaughtering women and children and babies and starving, 2 million people. Recently, Bernie Sanders had a change of heart, somewhat belatedly, but he is the one person, there may be a couple other scattered here and there, but he's sort of the one figure now who has refused to authorize, the next set of economic and military giveaways. He has kind of put his foot down to say, no, we can't just give them a blank check. But what people are, what they're asking for is, oh, let's have more targeted killing, and that's not going to solve it. In order to solve this, we really need to use international law. There probably needs to be UN peacekeepers to ensure that everyone's going to feel safe while a new, a new Israeli regime comes into play here and a new approach going forward. Whether that is a two-state solution or needs to be a one-state solution, it's not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to happen by itself. There really need to be some referees here. But the first thing that has to happen is that we have to stop, providing that blank check and providing the weapons by which people are being murdered. And neither party has come close to even, shedding a beam of light whatsoever, an iota of light on what's going on here. This is not about Hamas starting a war on October 7th. This is about a war that has been ongoing for a long time, in which, Gaza has been subjected to absolutely inhuman, punishing, and murderous conditions as a fact of daily life. So, the Hamas attack on Israel was horrific and barbaric, but that's what you get under the conditions, given the barbarism and the violence that's been imposed on Gaza from the get-go. So the whole thing has to be fixed. And by exercising this murderous assault on women and children and families, you're just guaranteeing what the next resistance will look like. It will continue to be violent. It may have a different name from Hamas, but this is going to be ongoing. This is why you can't have fascists, resolving this conflict. We need rules of international law to be applied here so we can begin to build a human solution and begin to rebuild relationships here and make this work and guarantee the security and peace for all people in the regions.
Jill, in November of last year, you announced your candidacy again to run for president for the Green Party USA. Can you talk about why you decided to go at it once more, and also about the policies that you're advocating?
So, in brief, I had not intended to run again for president, but I was very involved in Dr. Cornel West's campaign, and he was running as a Green. He decided to run independent for reasons that I completely understand, and that was a very amicable parting of ways. He's always been a solo voice, and it's very hard to learn new, a whole new way of operating in the heat of the battle of a presidential campaign. So it made sense and it was the right decision, but it happened late in the game. And, the condition for ballot access, if you want to be a player in the US, you have to go through enormous hoops to get on the ballot, very expensive and very time consuming. We had, and we still have, ballot access for the Green Party for many states and for many of the most difficult states. And if we didn't use it, if we did not have a candidate, we were going to lose it. We were going to lose what we have built up over decades of work, really. So we had to have a candidate. And I was, shall we say, I was arm twisted into stepping up because there aren't many people who sort of have the skills and the resources in place to be able to mobilize a team. So I jumped in with very short lead time because we had deadlines that we had to meet, basically to be on the ballot in California. It had to happen almost instantly. So without a lot of fanfare, we jumped in, and I was so grateful that we could do that. Grateful to all the people who've made it possible for us to be on the ballot and to be a real contender. Because if you're just in the race and you're saying powerful things, that doesn't actually get any traction whatsoever. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And that demand has to be made in the halls of power, or power doesn't care. They don't give a hoot what you think. It's only if you can really exercise the power of the vote against them. So the war against Gaza had just broken out before we launched. And I was so grateful as we were preparing that we would ensure that there will be an anti-genocide voice in this race that's on the ballot. There are other wonderful progressive voices, but they are not on the ballot, and they don't have much prospect for getting on. It's very hard to do that. Robert F. Kennedy is raising a huge amount of money, but he is a warmonger. He is he's all behind the Israeli attacks, and his talking points are exactly those of the Netanyahu regime. It's actually rather shocking. So there may be another independent candidate on the ballot across the country, but at this point, we are on track for getting on the ballot across the country. And we will ensure that this fight is not going to be silenced, and it cannot be kept out of the election dialogue. So we're, encouraging people to go to JillStein2024.com and find out about the campaign and, help make this happen, because this is how we assert political traction. If we have to wait for the International Court of Justice, for those wheels to turn, it's going to be a while. But as we build momentum as a political campaign, they will feel that heat. And polls right now show that, in fact, 20% of African Americans, 20% of Hispanics, and 21% of youth have already declared that they are not going to vote for Biden. There is an abandon Biden movement going on now, especially among those communities. And if we don't provide an option, either they are staying home or they're voting for Trump. Many of them have actually said they will vote for Trump in order to reject Biden. And what we are saying is that you don't have to have a protest vote for Trump. You can have a power vote for myself. We say dump Trump, abandon Biden, and join Jill. Join us in this fight for what we've been talking about for a long time. But now, the future is here, and not only in Gaza, but, in student debt, in the utter failure of our healthcare system, the decline of our economy, the insanity of our foreign policy based on economic and military domination. We have hit the wall. We've hit the wall, and Gaza is evidence of that. And we need a new way forward. And that's what's going on in our campaign. And it's as horrible as things are out there, it's just a wonderful happenstance right now that at a time people are in rebellion, in open rebellion against the political system, at a time when people are really clamoring for a pro-worker, anti-war climate emergency campaign. We're here going stronger than ever with a really powerful team on our way to getting on the ballot across the country. So the conditions, really the perfect storm, is here for political change. And whether we draw 51% of the vote or 5% of the vote, either way, it pushes the envelope. And it really moves the needle in a way that it must. Because if you're saying, oh, we've got to vote for the lesser evil, you're going to have a very hard time figuring out which one is the lesser evil right now, given that the Democrats are leading the charge on censorship, on war, on nuclear weapons. And that in so many ways they have just thrown working people under the bus, as well as the environment. There's mostly BS going on there in terms of the environmental policies. In fact, let me just give you one factoid: the LNG export facilities that are on track for being approved under Biden, there are 22 of them. They don't count in the roster of fossil fuel emissions. So, conveniently, those emissions are offshored. But if you actually include them, and they should be included, then the US basically is retreating to the year 2005 in terms of our fossil fuel emissions. So it reverses all progress. So those who say, oh, those terrible Republicans, you can't just now say terrible Republicans. You also have to say terrible Democrats, because Joe Biden is not only breaking all of his promises, but he's not doing the things that they claim to do. And that so-called wonderful Inflation Reduction Act bill, it actually requires 60 million acres offshore be auctioned off for fossil fuel every year, 60 million. And then I think 2 million onshore. This is unbelievable. And that has to be done before a single major project can be undertaken for renewable energy. So it's pure smoke and mirrors. And we're in a state of emergency on our climate, just as we are on foreign policy and the economy. So we say, forget the lesser evil. It's time to stand up and fight for the greater good, because we have nothing to lose here and we have everything to gain.
Can you also briefly talk about your policy towards the Ukraine war if you would come into power?
Well, we need to do what has been obvious from the start, and it's not rocket science about how to create a solution here. And let me say that this whole quagmire was really instigated by the U.S. Pushing NATO to expand eastward. This never would have been an issue. And then all along the way, there have been opportunities to respond to the understandable concerns of Russia about having nuclear compatible missiles right now and eventually nuclear missiles right on its border 5 minutes from Moscow. We did the same thing when Russia put its nuclear missiles in Cuba. We did not allow it. We launched our nuclear bombs. They were in the air, ready to be dropped. And then Khrushchev and Kennedy had the good sense to sit down and negotiate. Khrushchev removed his missiles, and then we agreed to remove our missiles, which were in Turkey at the time, to which Russia was responding by placing their missiles in Cuba. So, we sat down, we had dialogue. So even in the worst of the Cold War, things were far more reasonable than we were willing to be. Russia was trying to negotiate and we were refusing. That's not to say that Russia is the perfect actor here by any means. Russia can be faulted, absolutely, and its assault on Ukraine is illegal and murderous and horrific. Nonetheless, it was completely avoidable, and the U.S. was instigating it and refusing to make peace all along, including making a mockery of the Minsk Accords and disrupting the negotiations that took place in March, just a month or two into the war. So finally, Biden, I heard preliminary reports that he's finally agreeing that we're not going to win this. And it's just to the detriment and the abuse of Ukraine that Ukraine is paying in blood, sweat, and tears while we're footing the bill, a bill we can't afford to foot. And this has just been devastating all around. So finally, both Russia is putting out feelers for moving forward with that peace agreement that has always been on the table. And now, for the first time, Biden is acknowledging that the plan ain't working, folks, and this can't go on forever. And besides, they have a shiny new war now in Israel and Gaza. So who needs the Ukraine war? I mean, it's really hard to imagine how this is not being drummed up in the boardrooms of the war profiteers who are making out like bandits here while the rest of the world is really going down in flames. So it's not rocket science how to fix this, and our administration will begin to make that happen on day one.
To my last question, we are currently in a crowdfunding campaign and hope to raise enough funds to continue with our journalism this year. Why do you think it is important for people watching this video to support us going forward and in terms of independent media?
Well, just look at what Activism Munich has done, just being one of the few to tell the truth and shine light on this issue, on Ukraine, on, just the whole spectrum of global crises have been, really in the, in the headlines here. And this is such an important source of public education. It's fundamental to the U.S. Constitution. That's why we have, the Bill of Rights, and freedom of the press is number one. And because you cannot have a democracy without an educated electorate. And you have been doing such wonderful and courageous work when no one else has, and taking incredible abuse for saying things that the thronging mob did not want to hear. They still don't want to hear it, but it's really important. And we need to come to terms with the truth as being told now by independent media and really not by corporate media whatsoever. So I really encourage people to pony up and ensure that the future is strong and that we can be expanding activism and similar outlets for real news, because without it, there's not much hope for the future. But with it, we can be informed and empowered to basically change course. We need a drastic mid-course correction, and that won't happen without the likes of Activism Munich. So please support.
Dr. Jill Stein, physician, activist, and presidential candidate, thank you so much for your time today.
Great talking with you as always, Zane.
And thank you for tuning in today. Please don't forget to donate to our crowdfunding campaign so that we can continue with our independent journalism in 2024. Journalism that is viewer-funded and does not take any money from corporations and governments. You will find the links to our donation platforms in the description of this video below. Thank you for your support and generosity, and see you next time.
True democracy needs an informed public. A public where individuals recognize the value of information. Information that has been put into the right context. A context that challenges our convictions, and convictions that are not dogmatic, but that we are capable of developing. If we combine these elements, we can revitalize and strengthen one of the most important pillars of our democracy, journalism. The fourth estate, to help find solutions and build bridges rather than divide and marginalize. This is our vision as an independent, non-profit media portal. To ensure that we can remain independent and stay true to our vision, we do not accept any advertising or funding from corporations or governments. Our journalism depends entirely on you, the public, to stay alive. Social change thrives on participation. Become part of the change. If each of our subscribers donates only 3 to 5 euros per month, then together we will be able to create a network that makes a valuable contribution to opinion making. All of these small contributions come together to create something big.